Nobody likes to be pushed. And let me tell you, there's been a lot of pushing in 2020, especially when it comes to employment. And that's what we're going to talk about today on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Hey, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host, and I am so glad that you are here with me. Now, if you have not listened to the show before, let me give you the scoop. This show is dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, not to let it happen to you, but for you to rock retirement by making lots of intentional decisions and focusing on things that you can control. And there's been a lot of pushing going on because of this whole COVID disruption. And we're not going to talk about, obviously, the human impact, which is significant in terms of health. But there's been a lot of disruptions just to your daily lives. You can't hug people anymore. You're shaking hands. You can't do the things that you want to do. You got to wear a mask and it fogs up your glasses if you're older like me. But there's been a lot of pushing going around when it comes to employment. Some of it forced, furloughs, layoffs, let's just call it losing your job. But there's been pushing in some sort of interesting ways in terms of packages, companies offering little carrots to help you out the door. And both of these things accelerate potentially retirement plans and disrupt your life and force you to have to figure things out a little quicker than maybe you thought you needed to or wanted to. And that's what we're going to focus on this entire month is this unexpected retirement, either because it's forced upon you or you're given a deal that may be just too good to be true, and how you go about navigating these decisions or all the decisions that come about. So today we're going to talk about 5 things that probably everybody needs to do if this is thrust upon you. And then we're going to have an episode on those that are offered a package and how do you determine whether you take the package or not. And then we'll have an episode on what do you do if you ain't got no choice? This is happening. Where do you go from here? So that's what we're going to do this entire month. Now, before we get started, I want to tell you about next week's episode because it's going to be a special one. It's going to be a longer one. We are going to have a chat with Annie Duke. She is a famous poker player. She wrote a book that I'm a big fan of called Thinking in Bets, which is about decision analysis, decision making. And she has a new book coming out in about a week called How to Decide, which develops more practical frameworks for making decisions better. Making better decisions incrementally. And so we have a very wide-ranging discussion about how do you navigate decision-making so you can improve it, because that improving your decision-making just by a little bit will and can change the course of your life. So if you are part of our 6-Shot Saturday community where we send out a quick email every Saturday where we give you a recap of the show, I share some special links and resources, we're going to share a chapter of Annie Duke's book for you. And if you're not signed up for 6-Shot Saturday, it's really easy. You just go to rogerwhitney.com, enter your name and email address, and you'll get an email every Saturday morning. We promise not to spam you. And then if you're a member of the Rock Retirement Club, we're going to have the video interview in the club, but we're also going to have a full transcript of the chat so you can take it and highlight it and dissect it. With that, let's get on to what does that mean?
Huh? What does that mean?
Triage, the assigning of priority order to projects on the basis of where funds and other resources can be best used or are most needed in order to increase the likelihood of success. Triage. It has a medical terminology. You go into the ER, they do triage. They check your blood pressure. They see where the blood is gushing. They stabilize you and assess what's going on, where there are risks and where there are opportunities so they can figure out how to delegate or allocate their resources to best improve the patient. Well, the same thing works in financial circles. With a brand new client in my advisory practice, this is one of the first things that we do is, okay, what are really essential issues that we need to take care of? I'm not worried about planning for retirement if we're bleeding out cash over here and the patient will be suffering financially if we don't take care of that first. So in financial sense, you want to assess, okay, what's the condition of the patient and where do we need to allocate resources first before we can get to the longer term treatments? And so as we talk about these unexpected retirements, first thing you need to do is some triage. Assess where you're at, reorganize things, get your team together, and then walk through incrementally, what do you do first? And that's what we're going to talk about in the main segment. Triage is very important at the beginning of an engagement, obviously if you're an advisor, but for you, when life throws you a curveball, something really unexpected, especially if it's bad, this is one of the first places you start. Okay, reassess, get the pieces in place on the board so you can look to where you allocate your resources. And in your case, your resources are your time, your energy, and your money. Where do you allocate those three things? That's really what we're trying to get to here. Because if you think of, let's say you got laid off. Well, you got time, you got energy, and you got money. The one thing that can get really zapped in a situation like that is your energy, right? It can defeat you because you had your life in order. It was working. And suddenly, because of a push, it's not. That can really zap your energy, and which can zap your time because you spend time grieving over what has happened. And there needs to be a period of time there to grieve. But if we're not careful, it can zap too much time. And if we spend time and energy looking at what happens? We burn money while we're stuck, dead in the water. So that's the point of this, the idea of triage from a financial sense. And with that, let's go talk about the 5 things to work on initially to do this triage so you can get moving forward. So what are the 5 things that you need to do first if you are pushed from an employment standpoint, either in a good way or a bad way? Package, layoff. So we're going to go over these 5 things, but first I want to talk about what is the goal of this. It's the triage, right? The goal is to give yourself some breathing room so you can exhale and contemplate the change, digest that. And then secondly, to build a wireframe, which is like a framing of a house, a wireframe that gives you some structure so you can ultimately move forward. So that is the goal of these 5 steps. So step 1 is to get organized, right? To look at your situation, like, okay, I got to know what I'm dealing with here. What resources do I have to address this issue that has been thrust upon me? Get organized. And when we're talking about financial planning in your life, it comes down to some very basic things, right? Because if you get thrust into retirement, let's say you're laid off, you know what? That cable bill, that mortgage payment, the food that your family and you eat, you still got to spend money on that, don't you? Of course you do. So step 1 is to get organized. And what you want to understand that you may not have paid as much attention to because you were in autopilot, because you had your work and it was working, is you need to know your spending. You need to know what is the amount that you're spending every month. What are the obligations that you're going to have to cover this month, next month, the month after that? Because the month after that may be that college tuition. That's a spike in your obligations. And a good way to think of spending that I don't think we talk about enough in retirement planning, I know we talk about it in the club and I talk about it in my practice, is when you owe money for your mortgage, well, actually, let's say you owe money for groceries 2 months from now. That's like a debt. That's an I owe me. You owe that to yourself. If you spend $700 a month on groceries, well, 2 months from now, you're going to have to pay that debt, that $700, so you can eat. So spending and future spending, a good way to think about spending is liabilities. These are debts that you owe yourself. And these are the debts you got to pay first because you got to feed your family, you got to keep the lights on, etc. So these are debts. And when you're working, you have the cash flow to cover those debts each month as it comes. But when you find yourself out of work, whether it's retirement or forced, well, those debts still have to be paid. And so it's important to map out what those debts are. So step one is get organized. And when it comes to spending, map out the monthly debts you owe yourself for the next 12 months, because you might have some spikes in there of other obligations beyond just basic living. And when you map out your spending and you do it intentionally, it brings these things to light, and we'll be using that later on to figure out what you do next. Once you've done that in the get organized step, what you want to do is map out your income sources, because maybe you have two incomes. So you have all these debts, the spending that you have to cover. And if you have other income sources, well, that's going to help cover some of those debts, right? And that way you can know what the deficit is. If you have income sources of $4,000 a month, but you have spending or debts of $10,000 a month, now you know the deficit is $6,000 a month. That's the gap that you're going to have to fill somewhere. But you have to know this stuff. So step one is get organized, map out your spending for a year, map out your income sources for a year, and establish what is the deficit month by month for the next 12 months. That's probably a good thing to know. And then lastly, you want to organize your financial assets, your bank accounts, your investment accounts, your 401k, your debts, all the other things. You want to refresh your net worth statement, because most likely that is going to be an important component of filling the gap or paying for that deficit. We want to get that organized. And it's a good place to start because it helps you take action, especially if you're laid off. It's like getting pushed on your heels. So, I mean, close your eyes. And I was talking about the pushing metaphor. If you're walking forward, you're on your toes, you're living your life, and all of a sudden someone pushes you a little bit and you go back onto your heels. That's really what it feels like. Wait, whoa. The simple step of getting organized will help you start to lean forward again. Be on your toes so you can figure out what to do next. Once you've done that step, the second step is to check your liquidity. So if you're burning $6,000 a month because of this gap in income, you're going to have to say, okay, where am I going to fill that gap? If I don't do anything, I'm going to burn $6,000 a month. How do I fill that gap from my financial assets? And that's going to go to your emergency fund, which is essentially the financial airbag of life. What is my cash reserves to cover this monthly deficit that I'm about to incur? Because even if you're retired, you're dealing with this. Even if you got a package, you're going to want to go through the same exercise. And you want to check, what is my liquidity? How long until my cash reserves or my emergency fund is burned through? And then I got to figure out what next. That's really important. So check your liquidity. Third, and you really do this along the way, revisit what's important to you. You know, we've talked about establishing values. We've talked about dreaming for the future on past episodes. This is the time to connect of, okay, what's really important to you? And I've shared this story in some ways many times, but I remember when I was restarting my career, refreshing my career because I knew where I wanted to go. And as a result, and my wife wasn't working, this is 20 years ago now, and my income during this refresh went down by about 80%. I don't recommend that, by the way. And this is where I screwed up. Where my life was organized, it was organized for what my income was. And then I made this decision to refresh my career, to focus on what I felt I was supposed to be doing. And I navigated that really poorly. And so when my income went down by 80%, my lifestyle didn't, right? I still had those debts or obligations based on the life of that I was living before that I could no longer fulfill because of this big dip in income while I was going through this major transition. And because I managed it poorly, but I remember part of this was Shauna and I looking at the situation and really revisiting what was important to us. And what we decided was that we were going to move from the nice fancy house that I probably shouldn't have bought in the first place, move about 45 minutes away to a much more modest house that was perfectly fine. That was within a mile of her twin sister and her mother. And this is when we had really little kids. Spencer and Emma were really little. We said, why are we doing this? We're far away from family. We're far away from our support. We're far away from the people we hang out with the most. We can't afford this. I was working in Dallas at the time, which Dallas is great, but it's sort of the world of beautiful people. You got to keep up with the Joneses a little bit more in Dallas, at least I felt. And so not only did we move to a place that was really close to our family, the people we actually cared about, but I also moved my entire business and ecosystem from Dallas to Fort Worth, which is it's like a big small town, much more chill, more Western, less metropolitan. And these things were like, as we're sitting there on the couch, and this really took one night of, why are we here in the first place? And this house that we did too fancy for us, and you doing this drive to Dallas, why did we organize our life this way? And we reassessed what was important to us, and that got us to a place that was close to family in an environment that fit us more. Reassess what's important to you, because this is your chance. You got pushed, whether it was involuntary or not, but it could be an opportunity for you to reassess. Step 3 is to gather your team. That's your spouse, potentially your advisor, your CPA, good friends that know you, that you trust their opinion, and share with them as much as you can to help them give you perspective. We often talk about when you're inside the bottle of your life, think of like a Coke bottle. If you're inside the Coke bottle of your life, you can't read the labels on the outside because you have the perspective that's skewed from being inside that bottle. So you need to have your team, your peeps, to help you gain perspective on everything. That's going to help you make better decisions. So we have number 1, get organized. Number 2, check your liquidity. Number 3, revisit what's important to you. Number 4, gather your team so you can get perspective. And number 5 is determine what you do first, right? And so we know what the resources we have. We're organized. We understand our liquidity so we can figure out our burn rate. We've revisited who we are and what we want our life to represent. We've gotten perspective with our friends. Now the question is, what do you do? And honestly, this is where a lot of people get stuck, not just when you're dealing with a disruption like this, but this is where most people get stuck in retirement planning in general, because there are so many decisions that we have to make. I just wrote an article for Forbes about that. There are so many decisions that we have to make that we get decision fatigue, we get overwhelmed, so we don't make any decisions, or we just pick easy routes because we're tired mentally. I call it the wham. I always feel like I've talked about this stuff before because I talk about this stuff all the time and I forget who I talk about it to. So if I didn't, or you haven't heard it, I always call this the wham. Really what we need to be a better decision maker, whether we're being disrupted or not, is what I call wham, which is, what do I do next? That's really what we want to know. Okay, I've found myself in this situation. What do I do first or next? Once you get that, then, okay, how do I do it? What's the how? Then third is usually assistance or accountability to get it done. And then if we can figure out what to do, figure out how to do it, get some assistance and accountability to get it done, that will create momentum. That's a quick win, which is empowering. And then we just repeat the cycle. That's a beautiful cycle to be in. That's part of the purpose of agile retirement management, is to have the wham, is that momentum, that agency where you're acting, not being acted upon. So how do you determine what you do next? How do you do this step? Well, step 1 is you want to brainstorm opportunities. And this is where you can collaborate with your spouse or your friends or your advisor. You want to brainstorm opportunities. So what opportunities do you have if it's an unexpected retirement? Well, maybe you adjust spending. Maybe you lower the cable. Maybe you don't go out to eat as much, because if you do that, it will lower the burn rate, which will preserve your liquidity and give you more margin to be able to adjust. So look for opportunities to adjust spending. That's a valid place to do it, right? Maybe you don't buy the $20 bottle of wine. Maybe you buy the $10 bottle of wine. Maybe you reassess all these subscription things you're enrolled in to see if they serve you and your family. The hard part was spending adjustments. It's an important part, but you want to brainstorm there. But the hard part is they're hard to do because life goes on, right? And you can get draconian with it and zap some joy from your life. Second place you can brainstorm opportunities. What about income adjustments? And this is usually the biggest opportunity, if it needs to be included in the mix, of where you can move the dial. Okay, you can lower spending, but you can also increase income, even if it's interim, while you plan out your pie cake for retirement or you work on finding a new job. If you're out of work, you can do things to increase your income until you find your new gig. And so what are some ideas on income adjustments? Well, unemployment, if retirement's forced upon you, if you've gotten your package, maybe that has helped you because usually that includes income for a period of time. Working part-time doing something, even if it doesn't seem like much, it is in the sense that it brings money in, keeps you focused, and it's moving forward, not on your heels. But looking for ways that you can improve income during this interim time. Where else could we look for opportunities to do things first? Liquidity adjustments. Maybe your emergency fund needs to be bigger. If you have after-tax investments plus an emergency fund, perhaps you dial down your risk and increase your emergency fund until you figure out U 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0. I think I'm on 6.0. Roger 6.0. We iterate quickly. Maybe you increase your liquidity to give you breathing room to move forward. And sometimes when we do that, we think, well, if I do that, it feels like a permanent decision. Well, if I sell this and I increase my liquidity, then I'm going to miss out and I want to be a long-term investor. That is great. I agree with that in principle, but this is not a permanent decision. Once you figure out U 3.0, you can go back to your original plan, but you need the liquidity to give you space to figure out what to do. If you're wanting to go back to work, where are the opportunities in the job search market, right? Start to refresh your network, start to look for recruiters, update your LinkedIn, start to put your name out there, start to reassess what you want to do or what you're do a SWOT analysis of. Most of us don't realize how awesome we are in terms of the skills that we've developed because we're inside the bottle. So maybe you start to tease out skills. Maybe you're a great project manager, but you've never had the title project manager. Start to ramp up the job search if that's something that you're looking for. Or if you're not going to work because you got a package or this push that was unexpected is accelerating your plans. Well, I'm just going to retire and figure it out. Then you start to go through the agile process, the one that we teach in the course at Rock Retirement Club of, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I allocate all of my assets to make this work and know whether I have enough? You start to go through the retirement adjustment of building your pie cakes and so forth. The key is you just want to brainstorm, typically with one or two people that have perspective, to help think of all the possible opportunities. And this is where it can sort of bog down because you may have a big list. And now it's, which one do I do first? And this is critical. You have to figure out which one is the most important lever to pull first. Typically, it's going to be liquidity adjustments or spending adjustments to give yourself margin. Go back to that triage example. If someone comes into the hospital, the first step is to stabilize the patient. Forget what's going on with the patient. Treatment, let's stabilize the patient. Get an IV in their arm because that will give us time to diagnose and assess. So typically it's going to be spending adjustments or liquidity adjustments after you get organized. Maybe it's getting organized as the first step, but you got to choose one thing, maybe two things that you do first. And this is where we get back to the wham. I would rather you get one thing done quickly than try to do two things or three things and get bogged down. That's disempowering. That zaps your agency. Choose the first thing you need to do and then think of it as an agile project where you're iterating quickly. So if one thing is, I need to increase my emergency fund by $100,000 by selling this or moving that, that's the first thing. Don't worry about the thing after that. Do that one first. You can get that done in a day. And then you come back and say, okay, what next? Oh, I should look at my spending and cut the silly stuff. Well, how do I do that? Well, I go into my bank account and I look for silly stuff. And then I call and cancel them. And then what? The next. This is going to help take you from being acted upon to acting, to moving forward. Now, before I end this segment, I got to mention something. I'm so bad at this. On October 29th, which is a Thursday, at 7 p.m. Central Time, we're going to just have a live get-together. I'll call it a webinar, but we're just going to have a live get-together where we are going to, you and I and everyone else, talk through what do we do if we've gotten a package? What do we do if retirement has been thrust upon us? And I'm going to share some frameworks for you to use, and I'm going to answer your questions as well as maybe you can answer the question for someone else. So we're going to get together on October 29th and have a live get-together or a webinar where I'll do some mind mapping and we'll talk through this together so we can start to figure out our wham of how do we move forward and really rock retirement. So if you want to join me, and I hope you do, we'll have the links in 6-shot Saturday all throughout the month. With that, let's get to some of your listener questions. Welcome to the question and answer section of the show where we answer your questions because you are the whole purpose of the show. So if you have a question, something you're wondering about, or some feedback, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger, and we'll do our best to get it on the show. Our first question comes from Jim, and he says, if given the choice of what month to retire, what are the pros and cons of choosing a month? He's interested in the financial advantages when it comes to taxes and benefits, but also practical matters of summer, spring, fall, and other things going on. He just wanted to know what my thoughts are on that. And he gave me a suggestion of floating that in the Rock Retirement Club, which is a great idea, Jim. And I think we're going to do that. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't really put a lot of intentional thought on the time of year to retire. When I think of my experience with working with clients in the club, it generally is around April. And the driver to the April decision is generally around payouts on incentives or bonuses, etc. You have to be there usually by year end to be qualified for the bonus. Some people don't feel comfortable leaving until it's actually paid to them. So I think that leads to the April, but the deadlines of when you qualify for either vesting of a stock option or RSU or your incentive compensation or bonus, the deadlines for those are usually a date that people consider carefully. And then a lot of people, a good subset of those will wait until it's actually paid to them, which leads me to the March-April timeframe. But you make a good point of the softer side of things, the practical matters that actually line up pretty well with the March-April timeframe, right? Because we have longer days. We're coming out of winter into spring where it's warmer, more activities that you can do outdoors. And there's this psychological thought of new growth. So metaphorically, I guess it's a really cool time to retire, of new growth, a new beginning. So I think that actually has an impact on how we think about things, even if it's subconsciously. So I think March, April would be probably the biggest one. And the other part of that is it's a great opportunity, and I see clients do this a lot, of planning big excursions right after retirement. I have one couple who is going on like a 3-month RV trip. It's not their RV. They're joining another couple and they're going out west for 3 months or so and exploring. And it's coinciding with leaving work. And if you think about it, when you're working, you don't really have the opportunity to do things like that because of schedules, commitments, and vacation days. And so I think it's actually a good practice to do whatever month you decide to retire is figure out what you're going to do for the few months afterwards that will give you sort of a marker of this major change in life, which I think is cool. But two, also some mental space outside of just waking up in your own bed to contemplate who the next version of you is going to be. Now, you mentioned taxes. I think that's a good one to think about too, in the sense that you may retire prior to year end in order to front load or capture all of your realized income in that year. So your first year of retirement is a low income year. because that may benefit you from getting ACA subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. I have a client right now that we're coordinating how they pay for the first few years of retirement so they can qualify for subsidies for healthcare. And by doing so, in this case, it's saving them almost $1,000 a month. You retire mid-year, you're going to have 6 months where you're probably not going to qualify for that. And then, so that can be an advantage of making sure you get it done in calendar years. Also, in case of IRMA, although you can make some adjustments for that, but you might want to do that from a tax perspective if you're planning on taking money out of pre-tax accounts to fund lifestyle or to do major Roth conversions. So you might make a consideration of the timing for tax purposes with whatever the strategies you're pairing with your retirement. Ooh, it's pairing. That sounds like a wine thing. What do I pair with that? Merlot. So Jim, that's a great question, and I'll give it some more thought, but those are my initial thoughts. Our next question comes from Charlie on an early retirement offer. So Charlie, and thank you for all the detail, but I'm going to try to summarize it here. So he's 59 years old, and his company's offered him a package, and they reserve the right to select one of 6 release dates, but it's going to be in 2021. Charlie says his initial plan was to cover the majority of their living expenses via pension payments and eventually Social Security. He mentions that he and his wife have a few $1 million in 401k plans. But while meeting with a third-party financial consultant provided by the employer, and I'm just reading his words, to help employees evaluate their early retirement options, he seemed particularly impressed with the benefit of being able to take your pension as a lump sum for up to 120 days following your release date. In my case, the lump sum would be about $1.4 million. So you get $1.4 million as a lump sum. And if he chooses a pension option, the immediate pension, which would be for single life only, would be about $7,058 a month, or about $85,000 a year. So let's think of the options here. $1.4 million up front, or $85,000 for the rest of his life. And he'd probably take a 100% survivor, and he didn't give me that number. So he says, if I choose the lump sum, I'm basically going to have $3.5 million or so before tax assets, with the only guaranteed monthly income stream being Social Security. And he says it makes him nervous having all that money exposed to market variables. And so he's contemplating, because he does like the fact that if he took the lump sum, he gets all the assets and can be invested to help defend inflation, whereas the monthly pension has no inflation adjustment. He knows this comes down to a subjective decision, and he just wanted to get our thoughts. So it's that old pension versus lump sum issue. Comes up a lot. So Charlie, let's think about this. You have $85,000 a year pension versus $1.46 million cash in the hand. So your payout is almost 6% a year. $85,000 is about 6% of 1.46. If you don't take the pension, so I don't know the answer, you're right, it's very subjective, and it really comes down to your situation. It's not rule of thumb here. Some considerations when you're considering this are, do you have a lot other financial assets? You say you have $2 million in 401ks. Okay, so you got other financial assets. I don't know what you have after tax. 2, do you have a huge legacy goal? Because that might impact it. 3, what is the health of the company guaranteeing the pension? Because that's going to be a play in it. Is the company sound? Do you feel reasonably comfortable that the pension's funded? I will say, though, I would be very careful in taking the lump sum, because you're not going to most likely recreate that income stream. And again, I don't know what it is on joint life that you said you'd take. You're not going to be able to replicate that income stream buying an immediate annuity or potentially a deferred annuity. And that is most often the case when I look at these situations. Is it's a good deal from an income standpoint. And you mention that if you take the pension option, it's going to cover all of your living expenses, and then you're going to get Social Security added on top of that. That tells me that means that $2 million and whatever else you have in other types of assets is your inflation hedge and your slush fund for other things, for life happening or the lake house or what have you. I'm thinking here, it sounds like you'd be set up pretty good if you took the pension as payments. That covers your life. got Social Security on top of that. It takes all the pressure, not just off of you in managing all of this money, but we're going to think long-term here because you're making decisions, Charlie, for your future self as well. It takes the pressure off your wife of having to manage money if you predecease her. You could screw a lot of things up with the investment part of it and have guaranteed $85,000 a year plus Social Security, which is inflation adjusted. That's going to give you a really strong baseline to live a life. So I would be careful in taking that pension option. The real correct answer, and it's the horrible answer is, well, it's not a horror, it's the right answer, process, strategy, tactics. And that's what we teach in the course. And what we try to focus on in the club is you really have to start at the beginning because that will lead you to the right answer. And it sounds like if you're worried about having the money invested and having the responsibility of doing that or having an advisor do that, it seems like you're in pretty good condition if you just take the pension payments and then have all that excess money. Those are my thoughts. Hopefully that's helpful, Charlie. And with that, let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step we can take in the next 7 days to move forward to rocking not just life, but retirement too. All right, in the next 7 days, I want you to be uncomfortable. Actually, I'm going to be even bolder. I want you to be incompetent. How do you like that? I've been thinking about the personal development from last week and the SMART sprint from last week. And I came across this phrase of conscious incompetence. Who would consciously want to be incompetent? Well, you should, because that means you're doing something new. And that's the hard part. And that's where sometimes these pushes on a package or a layoff can actually be a blessing because prior to the push, we're competent in our work life and how our life is organized. And going into retirement, we feel a little incompetent because we've not done it before and it's not normal. But you have to be incompetent consciously. You have to make the choice consciously to be incompetent so you can progress into competence, just like a child learning to walk. And maybe that's the one thing that holds us back is that we're uncomfortable because internally, I don't know how to do that. I'm not competent there. Somehow we have to reasonably embrace conscious incompetence. So I want you to think about that and figure out where you can start doing that in your life. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Please send us your questions at rogerwhitney@askroger.com or your feedback. Maybe you have some ideas on the best time of year, that question that Jim had, and I'll be happy to try to share it on the show. And I hope you have a wonderful fall weekend. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Would not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize it's helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.